The galaxy was old, older than most. Civilizations cared to remember, it had seen stars born and die, had watched empires rise from nothing and collapse back into dust, and had kept spinning through all of it without pause or care. In 30,000 years, a lot could happen. Species could evolve, new powers could climb to the top, old ones could fall and be forgotten. Humanity was one of the forgotten ones. No one talked about them much anymore. There were no statues, no memorials, no great halls of remembrance built in their honor. They existed only in old data archives, buried under thousands of years of newer entries and in the footnotes of academic papers that almost no one bothered to read. The humans were a small and unremarkable entry in the galactic record, a primitive species from a single star system who had barely managed to reach their own neighboring planets before vanishing completely. No final war, no great plague, no last message sent into the void. They simply stopped existing as far as the rest of the galaxy was concerned, and the galaxy had moved on without looking back. Valkyrie consensus was the oldest of the three great powers now. They were tall, gray-skinned beings with large dark eyes and 4 arms that moved with quiet precision. They had been traveling between stars long before humanity had learned to write. Their civilization was built on logic, data, and careful measurement. They did not believe in things they could not prove. They did not waste time on legends or old ghost stories, and they certainly did not believe in the dead coming back to life. The Moon Collective was the second great power. They were smaller than the Valkyrie, stocky and pale, with wide flat faces and voices like low drums. They were traders and builders, famous for their massive fleets and their ability to organize resources across hundreds of star systems. They were practical above everything else. What could not be bought, sold, or turned into profit did not interest them, and dead species were not profitable. The Asari theocracy was the third. They were long-limbed and golden-skinned, with eyes that caught light in strange ways and voices that seemed to carry more than just words. They were spiritual, deeply so, and their entire civilization was built around a belief in something greater than the physical universe. Their priests were respected and feared in equal measure. They kept old texts that the other civilizations called mythology, and they believed in things that could not be measured. These three powers shared the galaxy in something close to peace, though it was the kind of peace that came from knowing the cost of war. They had their disagreements, their border conflicts, their political arguments that dragged on for decades, but open war had not happened in 800 years, and no one wanted to be the one to start it. Again, life went on. Ships moved between stars, data was exchanged, trade was conducted, the galaxy spun, and somewhere in the dark, beyond the edge of everything charted and known, something old began to move. The outer veil was not a place where sensible people went. It was a region at the very edge of the galaxy, past the last clusters of stars, where space became thin and cold and strange. The nebulae out there were dead things, old clouds of gas that had never formed stars and never would. The light was different in the outer veil. It came from far away and arrived faint and tired, as if the journey had taken something out of it. Navigation was unreliable. Sensors gave odd readings. Ships that ventured too far out sometimes came back with instruments that made no sense, logging data that the scientists back home would scratch their heads over for. The Valkyrie sent survey vessels out there sometimes not because they expected to find anything, but because their nature demanded that they map and measure everything, even the things that seemed not worth mapping or measuring. It was a matter of principle. The survey vessel was called the Measured Step. It was not a large ship carrying a crew of 12, all of them scientists and data officers. Its job was simple: travel into the outer regions, collect readings from a series of pre-mapped coordinates, and return home with the data. It was boring work, the kind of work that junior crew members got assigned to when their supervisors wanted to keep them busy without giving them anything important to do. The captain was a veteran named Voskaren, patient and experienced, and very much looking forward to retiring. Once this tour was finished, the science officers went about their routines without excitement. The data rolled in: gas densities, radiation levels, gravitational readings, the usual. Nothing, everything was normal. And then on the 4th week of the survey run, the sensors picked up something that was not normal at all. It appeared on the long-range screen as a simple contact marker. The system flagged it as anomalous because its size and shape did not match any known natural object in the database. It was not a rock. It was not a gas cloud. It was not a dead star or a piece of scattered debris from some ancient collision. It was a ship. Karen stared at the contact for a long time before she said anything. Then she called her senior science officer to the bridge and pointed at the screen without speaking. The science officer looked at it. He leaned closer. He ran the analysis twice. Then he straightened up and said very quietly that the contact appeared to be a vessel of artificial construction, approximately 4 km in length, moving under what seemed to be active propulsion. 4 km, that was not a small ship. That was enormous by most standards. Voskaren ordered the Measured Step to reduce speed and hold position. She then ordered a full sensor sweep of the contact. The results came back over the next hour, and with each new piece of data, the atmosphere on the bridge grew a little more tense and a little more quiet. The ship's hull was made of materials that the Valkyrie database did not recognize, not completely anyway. Some elements matched known metals and alloys, but the specific combination, the specific layering and treatment, nothing in the archive came close to a match. The design language of the hull, the arrangement of its sections, the geometry of its engine ports, all of it pointed to an origin that was deeply, disturbingly old. The database's best match was flagged as low confidence, but it was there. Hull design consistent with records from the early galactic exploration era, approximately 30,000 years prior. Species of origin listed as human. Homeworld Sol 3, status extinct. The bridge was very quiet after that. Voskaren sent a hail. She used standard galactic frequency, the universal emergency band, and 3 other backup channels. She waited. Ship did not respond. It did not chain course. It did not slow down or speed up. It simply continued moving slow and steady and indifferent on a heading that pointed directly toward the galactic core. She sent the contact report back to consensus headquarters and marked it as a priority observation. Then she watched the ship until it passed beyond their sensor range, and she kept watching the empty space where it had been for a while after that. Sathara 9 was 23 years old, which made her very young by Valkyrie standards. She worked in the Consensus Central Archive, which was a prestigious enough position for someone her age, but in practice meant that she spent most of her days processing old data files and organizing records that no one had looked at in centuries. It was not exciting work, but Sathara 9 was the kind of person who read everything, even the things she was not supposed to find interesting. She found the contact report 3 days after it was filed. She almost missed it. It had been placed in a low priority queue by the receiving officer who had processed it, and a note had been added saying that the sensor readings were likely instrument error caused by the unusual conditions in the outer veil. The recommendation was to archive the report without follow-up and schedule recalibration check for the measured steps instruments on its return. Sathara 9 read the recommendation, then she read the actual report, then she read it again. She pulled the hull design analysis and cross-referenced it with the archive's historical records on early galactic civilizations. She spent 4 hours reading through the human entries, the limited and often contradictory records of a species that had existed on the edges of galactic contact, never quite making it to full membership in any interstellar body. Before they disappeared, most of the data was thin. There were physical descriptions, some records of early radio transmissions that had reached Valkyrie listening posts thousands of years ago, a few intercepted communications from what appeared to be early-stage space travel, nothing extensive, nothing impressive, but the whole design analysis matched, not perfectly but closely enough that the archive system had flagged it, even at low confidence. The geometry was consistent, the material signatures overlapped at several key points. She flagged the report for escalation and sent it to her supervisor. Her supervisor read it and told her that instrument error in the outer veil was extremely common and that she should not spend too much time on this. He marked the escalation as reviewed and closed it. Sathara 9 sat at her desk for a long time after that. She looked at the report. She looked at the closed status marker. She thought about the image the sensors had captured. Blurry, taken at extreme range, but there a shape in the dark, something moving that should not have been moving. She made a decision that would change her life and, as it turned out, the lives of everyone else in the galaxy as well. She booked leave, told no one where she was going, and by the end of the week she was sitting in the cockpit of a small rented scout ship at the edge of Valkyrie space, pointing her nose toward the outer veil. The journey to the outer regions took 2 weeks at the scout ship's top speed. Sathara 9 used that time to study everything she could find about humanity. She went deep into the archive's oldest records, pulling files that had not been accessed in so long that the system flagged her requests as unusual. She read the old radio intercepts. She studied the physical data on the human homeworld, a planet with high oxygen content, liquid water, oceans, and a biosphere of extraordinary complexity and variety. She read the few records of early contact attempts, none of which had ever been completed because by the time Valkyrie scouts had located the solar system, the humans were already gone, just gone. No Wreckage, no bodies, no final message. The solar system had been surveyed 4 times over the centuries, and all 4 surveys had found the same thing. Quiet system, habitable worlds, evidence of past civilization, and nothing else. The working theory had always been that the humans had managed to destroy themselves before reaching the stars, which, given the limited data on their history, seemed like a plausible enough explanation. Cythera 9 read all of this and tried to build a picture in her mind of what kind of species they had been. It was difficult. The records were thin, too distant, but some things came through clearly enough. They were small, by galactic standards, bipedal, relatively fragile physically. They had a very short natural lifespan, but they were, by every measurable indicator, relentless. The radio intercepts showed a species, constant motion, always building, always experimenting, solving problems only to immediately find new ones to tackle. Their early space technology was rough and inefficient, but they had developed it fast, very fast. There had been a Valkyrie scholar, Cythera 9, found, who had written a paper about humanity about 8,000 years ago. The paper was mostly dismissed at the time and barely remembered now, but one line from it sat in her mind for the rest of the journey. Of all the species in the early contact records, the humans are the only ones of whom I find myself thinking, had they been given more time, what would they have become? Cythera 9 looked at the blank dark outside her cockpit window and thought about that question for a very long time. She found the ship on the 31st day. It appeared on her sensors gradually, like something emerging from deep water. First as an energy reading, faint but steady, then as a mass contact, large and solid, then as she brought her ship in slowly on a careful approach vector, as a shape against the distant glow of the galaxy's edge. It was bigger than she had expected, even having read the survey report. 4 kilometers of ship, maybe more. She could not be certain, because sections of it seemed to have been added at different times, the hull patched and extended and modified in ways that spoke of long, long years of maintenance and repair. The original design was still visible in the basic structure, the skeletal shape of a vessel built for deep exploration, long and narrow with wide engine housings at the rear. But so much had been added to it, so much had been changed, that it was like looking at a building that had started as one thing and had been rebuilt around itself many times over. The hull was dark in most places. Whatever coating had once covered it was long gone, replaced by the natural discoloration of metal that had been in hard space for an impossible amount of time. But there were lights, not many, but they were there, warm amber-colored, visible through the seams of certain hull sections and through what appeared to be observation windows spaced along the ship's middle section. Cythera 9 stopped her ship at a distance of 2 km and sat looking at it. It was real. It was actually there. She had half convinced herself during the 2-week journey that she was chasing a sensor ghost, that she would arrive in the outer veil and find nothing and have to go home, feeling foolish. But it was there. She checked the hull markings with her scanner. They matched the design language in the archive record, old script, the kind of lettering style that the human radio intercepts had also used. She could not read it. The archive did not have a full translation index for human script, but the scanner matched several letter shapes to known samples, and returned a partial reading. USCS Enduring Resolve, she said the words out loud in her own language, translating the sounds as best she could. They meant something close to that which continues to hold on. She sat with that for a moment. Then she reached for the communications panel and opened a hail on the standard frequency. This is Scout Vessel Narrow Path Valkyrie. Registration to the unidentified vessel. Please respond. She waited 30 seconds. Past a minute, the ship continued on its course unchanged. She tried again. She tried different frequencies. She tried the universal emergency band. She tried a simple mathematical sequence, the kind of first contact protocol that was taught to all galactic travelers as a baseline for reaching unknown intelligences. Nothing. She was about to try again when the communication panel lit up with an incoming signal. The voice that came through was calm and clear. It spoke in perfect Valkyrie with an accent that Cethera 9 could not place. Something almost musical in the way it shaped the words. Scout Vessel Narrow Path, we detected your approach 14 hours ago. We have been listening to your hails. I apologize for the delay. I wanted to be certain of your intentions before making contact. Cethera 9's hands were very still on the console. She kept her voice steady. Who am I speaking with? My name is Marin, said the voice. I am the primary artificial intelligence of the USCS Enduring Resolve. I have been active and operational for 30,216 years. You are the first non-human contact I have had in that time. Pause. I have a great deal to tell you, Marin said, if you are willing to listen. Cethera 9 looked at the great dark shape of the ship, at its amber lights warm against the cold of deep space, at the hull that had been repaired and rebuilt and repaired again across 30,000 years of silence. Yes, she said, I'm willing to listen, and she meant it with every part of herself. Outside the cockpit, the Enduring Resolve moved on through the dark, patient and steady, heading home. The first thing Cethera 9 noticed about Marin was that it never rushed. Most AI systems she had worked with in the Valkyrie consensus spoke quickly and efficiently, delivering information in tight, organized packets. They were built for speed and precision. Emotion and patience were not part of their design. They answered what was asked and stopped talking the moment the answer was complete. Marin was different. Marin spoke the way a very old person speaks, someone who has lived long enough to understand that there is no real hurry, that the important things are better said carefully than fast. There was weight behind every word, as if each one had been considered before it was given. Cethera 9 sat in her scout ship for 2 hours, just listening to Marin introduce itself, not because the introduction was long, but because she kept asking more questions and Marin kept answering them with the kind of quiet, steady detail that made her want to ask more. Eventually, Marin asked if she would like to come aboard. She said yes before she had fully thought about what that meant. The docking process was unlike anything Cethera 9 had experienced before. The Enduring Resolve did not have a standard docking port in the modern configuration. The connection systems used by current galactic vessels had not existed when the ship was built. But Marin talked her through a manual approach, guiding her scout ship to a section of the hull that had been modified at some point in the distant passed to accommodate external vessels. The fit was not perfect. There was a clunk, a hiss of pressure equalization, and then the small connector tunnel between her ship and the Enduring. Resolve locked into place. Sithara 9 sat for a moment with her hand on the hatch release. She was a long way from home. No one knew where she was. She was about to walk into a ship that had been drifting in deep space for 30,000 years, crewed by the descendants of a species that no one had seen in all that time. She released the hatch and went through. The air on the other side was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. Warmer than she expected, almost comfortable with a faint smell she could not identify, something organic and clean like soil after rain. The corridor she stepped into was narrow but not cramped, with walls that had been resurfaced many times. She could see the layers if she looked closely, old metal under newer panels, some sections smooth and clean, others rough with age and repair work. The lighting was that same amber color she had seen from outside, warm and steady, coming from strips built into the ceiling. There was no one waiting for her. "I will guide you," Marin said. The voice came from a small speaker panel just above the corridor. "Junction ahead. The crew are aware of your presence. They have chosen to give you time to settle before any introductions. They understand that this may be a significant experience for you." Sithara 9 almost laughed at that. Significant experience, that was one way to put it. She followed Marin's directions through the ship, turning where she was told to turn, walking corridors that curved and branched in ways that felt organic rather than planned, as if the ship had grown rather than been built. And in a sense, she was beginning to understand. It had 30,000 years of repair and modification, and rebuilding had turned the original vessel into something that was part machine and part living history. Layers of time stacked on top of each other. Marin brought her to a room near the center of the ship. It was larger than the corridors, roughly circular, with low furniture arranged around a central table. The furniture was made of something that looked like wood, though Sithara 9 could not imagine where wood had come from out here in the void. On the table was a container of warm liquid and a small plate of food she did not recognize. "Please sit," Marin said. "I thought it would be better to begin with the logs." "The logs," Sithara 9 said. "The mission logs of the Enduring. Resolve," Marin said. 30,000 years of recorded history. I have prepared a summary. It will take approximately 6 hours to go through the key entries. I believe it is important that you understand what happened to us before you meet the crew." Sithara 9 sat down. She wrapped her hands around the warm container. It was some kind of drink, and it tasted faintly sweet and slightly sharp, not unpleasant, and she nodded. "Begin," she said. The Enduring Resolve had launched from Earth orbit 30,216 years ago. At that time, humanity was young by galactic standards, but moving fast. They had established colonies on several worlds within their home system, had developed functional faster than light travel through a drive technology they called the Resonance Fold, and had begun sending long-range explorer vessels out toward nearby star clusters. The Enduring Resolve was one of 12 such vessels launched in the same decade. Its mission was deep space mapping, to travel outward from the galactic plane, chart the structure of the outer regions, and return within 50 years with the data. It carried a crew of 847 people, scientists, engineers, navigators, doctors, soldiers, and everyone else needed to keep a large ship operational. For a very long journey, the mission went smoothly for the first 11 years. Then the drive failed. Marin played the log entry from that moment. The voice of the original chief engineer, a man named Darius Chun, was calm in the recording, but had an edge to it that came through, even across 30,000 years of archive. Compression, resonance fold. Drive has gone into catastrophic misalignment we are unable to correct. From engineering, the fold is not collapsing, it is expanding. I repeat, the fold is expanding. If this continues, I do not know where we will end up. All hands brace. The fold had not simply failed, it had torn open in an uncontrolled direction, carrying the ship with it. When the enduring resolve dropped back into normal space, its navigation systems were useless. Every star field reference they tried to match failed because no star field reference they had in their database matched what was outside their windows. They were beyond the galaxy, not just outside the charted regions, beyond the galaxy itself, in the empty intergalactic void where the nearest light was a smear on the horizon and the nearest star was further away than anything their drive, even if repaired, could have hoped to reach. Marin paused the log there and let Saturan 9 sit with that for a moment. How far? Saturan 9 asked. Our best reconstruction puts the exit point at approximately 2.3 million light-years from the galactic edge, Marin said, in the void between this galaxy and the next. Saturan 9 looked at the table. 2.3 million light-years in a ship with a broken drive with a crew of 847 people. What did they do? She asked. What humans do, Marin said. They got to work. The logs that followed covered the first 300 years in the void. Saturan 9 listened carefully, and as she listened she began to understand that the story she was hearing was not a story of despair. Though despair had certainly been present in those early years, it was something else. The first generation, the original crew, had faced the truth of their situation with a clarity that Saturan 9 found almost painful to listen to. They were not going home, not on any time scale that meant anything to them personally. The drive was reparable in theory, but the materials required were not available in the void, and the calculations needed to plot a return course through intergalactic space were beyond their current computational ability. Their children might have a chance, their grandchildren might have a better one, but the 847 people who had left Earth would grow old and die in the dark. Most of them, according to Marin, had accepted this within the first decade. There had been grief, there had been conflict, there had been 3 serious attempts at mutiny in the first 50 years, all of them resolved without fatal violence. But the majority of the crew had looked at their situation and made a decision that Saturan 9 found remarkable. They decided to treat the void not as a prison but as a laboratory. There was nothing else to do, and humans, it seemed, could not survive without something to do. They began to study the void itself, the intergalactic medium, the thin scattering of gas and particles that filled the space between galaxies was not truly empty, and within 2 centuries the crew of the enduring resolve had developed a more detailed understanding of it than any civilization Sethra 9 knew of. They mapped gravitational currents. They discovered that certain regions of the void had properties that did not match standard models of physics. They began building new models. They also rebuilt their ship. The first major reconstruction happened at year 112, when the original hull sections in the rear third of the vessel had degraded past safe operating limits. The crew stripped them down to the frame and rebuilt them using a new alloy they had developed themselves, combining trace materials harvested from the void medium with processed elements from the ship's own non-essential structures. The result was stronger and more resilient than the original. They did it again at year 400 and again at year 900. The ship you are currently sitting in, Marin said, shares approximately 11% of its physical material with the original enduring resolve. The rest has been replaced, rebuilt, or added at various points across the 30,000 years. I'm aware that this raises philosophical questions about identity and continuity. The crew has discussed those questions at length. Most of them find them interesting rather than troubling. Sethra 9 looked at the walls of the room around her and tried to imagine the number of hands that had worked on them across 30,000 years. The biological changes were harder to listen to, not because they were disturbing exactly, but because they were so deliberate, so careful, so deeply characteristically human in their approach. By year 500, the crew had recognized a problem. The void was not a healthy environment for human biology. Over the long term, certain radiation types present in the intergalactic medium caused cellular damage that accumulated slowly across generations. Cognitive function showed measurable decline in populations exposed to the low stimulation environment of the void. Not dramatic decline, but enough to matter over centuries. And the simple physical demands of maintaining a large ship in complete isolation with no supply lines and no outside support were putting pressure on the crew's bodies in ways that standard medicine could only partly address. So they fixed it over the next 2,000 years through a process that was entirely consensual and carefully managed across every generation. The crew of the Enduring Resolve modified themselves. They did not do it recklessly. Every change was studied, debated, tested where possible, and agreed upon by the community before it was implemented. Changes that proved harmful were reversed or corrected. The following generation, changes that worked were kept. Marin played several log entries from this period. Sethra 9 listened to scientists and community leaders and ordinary crew members debate the ethics and the biology in terms that were sometimes beyond her, but whose seriousness was always clear. These were not people acting in desperation. They were people making thoughtful choices about their own future. The results across 30,000 years were significant. The humans aboard the Enduring Resolve were not the same biological creatures who had left Earth. They were longer, lived much longer, though Marin would not give specific numbers yet. They were more physically resilient. Their cognition had been modified in ways that were difficult to summarize briefly, but Marin described it as an increase in the capacity for long-term patience and parallel processing, combined with no reduction in the emotional and creative functions that the crew had been careful to protect. They were afraid, Marin said, of becoming something that did not feel things anymore. Every generation met. Sure, that was not the path they took. Sethra 9 set down the drink she had been holding. She had not noticed until now that her hands were not quite steady. The discovery of the return path came at year 29,411. By that point, the crew of the Enduring Resolve, now many generations removed from the original 847, had accumulated a body of scientific knowledge that had no parallel in the known galaxy. 30,000 years of uninterrupted research in one of the most unusual environments in the universe, conducted by minds that had been carefully shaped for exactly this kind of work. They had developed entirely new branches of physics. They had mapped the intergalactic void in more detail than any civilization had ever imagined doing. They had understood things about the structure of space and time that the best minds of the Valkyrie Consensus, the Moon Collective, and the Asari Theocracy had not yet come close to asking the right questions about. And they had found something, a pulsar at the very edge of the galactic boundary, a rapidly rotating neutron star whose emissions created a gravitational pattern in the surrounding space that, if approached at exactly the right angle and exactly the right velocity, would function as a natural slingshot, not back to Earth, not precisely, but into the galaxy, into the outer regions, into reach. The calculation had taken 60 years to complete and verify. Sethra 9 listened to the log entry from the day it was confirmed. The voice belonged to a woman named Commander Ilara Voss, who introduced herself as the 47th generation commander of the vessel. She read the final confirmation of the calculation to her crew, and when she finished reading, there was a silence on the recording that lasted almost a full minute. Then the sound of 800 people, all of them crying, not from sadness, from the other thing, the thing that comes after a very long wait. Sethra 9 realized somewhere in the middle of that minute of sound that she was crying too. She sat alone in the warm amberlit room of a 30,000-year-old ship in the middle of the dark, and she let the tears run down her face without trying to stop them, because some moments did not deserve to be held back from. The logs ended. Marin was quiet for a while. Sethra 9 wiped her face and sat straight in her chair. Outside, through the hull, she could not see through. The galaxy was getting closer. She could feel distantly the slight vibration of the ship's engines, rebuilt, redesigned, running on principles that no engineer in the known galaxy would have recognized, but running steadily and surely. How many are there? She asked. On board. How many crew? 809. Marin said, we have kept the population stable across many generations. It is the number the ship can sustainably support, and they all know. Sethra 9 stopped, tried again. They were born on this ship, all of them. None of them have ever seen a planet. That is correct, and they want to go back to Earth, to a home none of them have ever seen. There was a small pause before Marin answered, not a processing pause. Sethra 9 had already learned that Marin did not have processing pauses. It was a considered pause, the kind that meant the next words had been chosen carefully. There is a word in the original human language, Marin said, that has no direct translation in Valkyrie. The closest equivalent your language offers is something like deep longing for a place you belong to. The humans used it to describe the feeling of missing home on this ship across 30,000 years and 47 generations. That word has never left the vocabulary, not once. Every generation taught it to the next. Every child born on the ship learned it as one of the first words they ever knew. Sethera 9 looked at the room around her, at the wooden furniture made by hands she would never know, at the warm amber light that some engineer 1,000 years ago had decided to use because it was closer to sunlight than cold white. "What is the word?" she asked. Marin told her. Sethera 9 could not pronounce it properly, but she tried anyway. It came out soft and a little broken in her mouth, like something that did not quite fit the shape of her language, but she understood it. She understood it completely. Outside the ship, the galaxy grew slowly brighter as the enduring resolve pressed on through the dark, steady and patient and impossibly, stubbornly alive. The report could not be kept quiet forever. Sethera 9 had known that from the beginning. She had gone into the outer veil alone, and without authorization had made contact with an unknown vessel, and had been aboard that vessel for 11 days before anyone in the Valkyrie consensus had thought to check where she was. When they did check, they found her personnel file, her access logs showing weeks of deep archive research into human records, and the automated location ping from her scout ship sitting docked against the hull of something enormous that was moving steadily toward the galactic core. The consensus response was not subtle. Within 48 hours of locating her, Sethera 9 received a direct communication from the Office of Senior Director Vas Marin, one of the 12 most powerful individuals in the entire Valkyrie government. The message was formally worded and very short. It told her to stay where she was, to make no further communication with the unknown vessel without official authorization, and to consider herself under administrative hold pending a full review of her conduct. She sent back a reply that was equally short. She told the senior director that she understood that she would remain in her current location, and that she respectfully suggested the consensus begin preparing for something larger than an administrative review. She did not tell them what she had heard in the logs, not yet. She wanted them to come and see for themselves. Some things could not be understood from a report. Some things had to be stood in front of. The Valkyrie were not the only ones watching. The enduring resolve was not a quiet ship. 30,000 years of continuous operation meant that it produced a broad spectrum of emissions, engine output, heat signature, low-frequency communications between its internal systems, the occasional burst of what Marin described as ongoing research transmissions. Any long-range sensor network worth its design would pick up a vessel that size once it crossed into the outer regions of the galaxy. 3 networks did. The Valkyrie consensus had the most sensitive instruments and responded first, which was how Sethera 9 had ended up where she was. But within 2 weeks of her boarding, the enduring resolve, the Mune Collective, and the Asari theocracy had both independently confirmed the contact and filed their own internal reports. Mune response was practical and immediate. A collective council session was convened, the data was reviewed, and a decision was reached in less than a day. The vessel was unknown, its origins were uncertain, its intentions were unknown, and it was heading toward the populated regions of the galaxy at a speed that would bring it into the outer star systems within months. That was not a situation the collective was willing to leave unmanaged. They dispatched a fleet, 40 warships, their hulls painted in the gray and gold of Mune military authority, moving in a tight formation. That made their purpose clear to anyone watching. The fleet commander was Admiral Dorsh 7, a hard-faced veteran of 3 border conflicts who had never lost an engagement and had never been known to hesitate once a decision was made. His orders were clean and simple. Intercept the unknown vessel, halt its progress, and conduct a full boarding and quarantine assessment. Biological containment protocol. The official filing said. Everyone who read the filing understood that biological containment was not the real reason. The real reason was that a ship no one had ever seen, from a species no one had seen in 30,000 years, moving through your territory without asking permission, was the kind of thing that scared people who were used to being the ones in charge. Dorsh 7 did not ask questions about the history of the vessel. He did not request the archive files on human civilization. He was not interested in the logs or the story or the science. He was interested in the intercept coordinates and the weapons loadout of his 40 ships, both of which he reviewed several times during the journey to make sure everything was in order. The Asari theocracy's response was slower and stranger. When the contact report reached the High Council of the Theocracy, there was a period of 3 days where nothing official happened at all, behind closed doors. However, the priests were doing something they rarely did in the modern age. They were pulling out the oldest texts. The Asari kept records that went back further than any other living civilization. Not all of those records were factual history. Many were spiritual documents, collections of belief and prophecy and oral tradition that had been written down over thousands of years. The other galactic powers regarded most of these texts as mythology, interesting as cultural artifacts, but not as serious sources of information about the real world. The priests regarded them differently. There was a cycle of texts, very old, from a period approximately 32,000 years ago. They described a series of visions experienced by a group of Asari spiritual leaders who had reported across several decades seeing the same images in their meditations. A people of short lives and enormous will, cast out from their world and into the great dark between the stars. The texts describe these people in terms that the modern Asari found uncomfortable to read because they were terms of awe, not pity. The text said that the people of short lives would be told by forces greater than themselves that they could not survive, that the dark would take them, that nothing so brief and so fragile could endure the void between the stars. The text said that the people would not listen. There was one line copied into 17 separate documents across different centuries that the High Council found themselves reading again and again in those 3 days. Translated into the closest modern equivalent, it said, asterisk, and they came back, and they were not what they had been, and the stars that had not known them wept to see them, asterisk. The High Council sent a delegation, not soldiers, priests, 7 of them, traveling in a single ceremonial vessel, carrying the old texts in a formal Message of greeting that had taken 2 days to compose because everyone who tried to write it kept stopping and starting over. Sethera-9 knew none of the details of these responses at first. She knew only what Marin told her, and Marin was monitoring every sensor channel available to the enduring resolve with a thoroughness that she was beginning to understand was characteristic of the ship's AI. You have incoming vessels, Marin told her on the morning of her 12th day aboard. Multiple contacts. The larger group is Moon Configuration 40. Ship's military class. The smaller contact is a sorry ceremonial design 1. Vessel. Sethera-9 felt her stomach drop. How long? The Moon fleet will reach intercept range in approximately 9 hours. The Asari vessel in approximately 14. And the Valkyrie, a response vessel from the consensus, is currently 6 days out, moving at high speed. Marin paused. There is also a significant amount of long-range communication traffic that suggests both the consensus and the collective are in active discussion with each other and with the theocracy. The content is encrypted, but the volume and frequency suggest a high level of concern. Sethera-9 pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed slowly. 40 moon warships. She knew what that meant. She had grown up in a political household and had studied enough galactic history to read a fleet deployment when she saw one. This was not a greeting party. She asked Marin if the crew was aware. Yes, Marin said. Commander Voss was informed as soon as the contacts were confirmed. How did she respond? Another of Marin's small, considered pauses. She said she would like to speak with you before the intercept. She is waiting in the forward observation room if you are ready. Commander Ilra Voss was not what Sethera-9 had expected. She had built a picture in her mind from the log entries, a figure of authority and calm. The 47th, in a line of leaders stretching back to the original crew. She had expected someone who felt historic. Somehow, someone who carried the weight of 30,000 years visibly on them. The woman who stood at the forward observation window was of medium height, with dark brown skin and close-cut gray hair, wearing simple work clothes that looked like they had been mended several times. She was looking out at the distant glow of the galaxy when Sethera-9 entered, and she turned with a small smile that was warm and completely unhurried. She looked, Sethera-9 thought, like someone's grandmother, the comfortable kind, the kind that had seen enough of life to find most things either amusing or manageable. But her eyes were different. It was the first thing you noticed if you looked carefully. They were dark and very still, and behind the warmth in them there was something that did not have a simple name. Depth, maybe. The kind of depth that came not from alone, but from a particular kind of life, a life lived at the edge of everything. You must be the one who came looking for us, Commander Voss said in Valkyrie that was clear and easy, spoken without hesitation. Sethera-9 said. Yes, good instincts, Voss said. Simply. She turned back to the window. Marin tells me we have company coming. 40 moon warships, Sethera-9 said. I think you should know, the moon military does not deploy 40 ships for a welcoming ceremony. No, Voss agreed, it doesn't. She was quiet for a moment, studying the stars. We've been watching their approach. Marin has run their vessel configurations against the technical databases we've built up over the years. We have a fairly complete picture of their weapon systems. Sathura 9 looked at her. You've been building databases on current galactic civilizations. We've been listening to transmissions from the galaxy for about 800 years. Voss said with the same easy tone she might have used to discuss the weather. Long-range fragmentary, but enough to build a working picture over time. We know the major powers, we know the general political structure, we know enough. She paused. We wanted to understand what we were coming back to. 800 years of listening. Sathura 9 filed that away and kept her expression neutral. What are you going to do? She asked when the Mune fleet arrives. Commander Voss turned from the window. The small smile was still there, but it had changed slightly. It was quieter now, more serious. Talk to them. She said that is always the first choice. She looked at Sathura 9 steadily. We did not come 30,000 years through the void to start a war on the doorstep. That is not who we are. The Mune fleet arrived in 8 hours and 40 minutes, slightly ahead of Marin's estimate. They came in fast and pulled into a blocking formation directly ahead of the Enduring Resolve's course line, a classic intercept spread, the kind designed to make absolutely clear that the vessel ahead had 2 options: stop or go through them. 40 ships, all of them larger than Sathura 9 scout vessel. Their weapons arrays visible and active. Their running lights set to the red configuration that in Mune military protocol meant we are prepared to use force. Admiral Doris 7 did not waste time on pleasantries. His transmission came through on the open hailing frequency, loud and flat and official. He identified himself, identified his authority under Moon collective law, and issued a formal order for the unknown vessel to come to a full stop. Immediately submit to a boarding assessment and await further instruction. He gave a deadline of 30 minutes. He did not say what would happen at the 31-minute mark, but 40 warships in blocking formation said it clearly enough. Sathura 9 stood in the communications room of the Enduring Resolve and watched Commander Voss listen to the transmission. Voss's face did not change during it. She listened to the whole thing without moving, and when it was finished she stood quietly for a moment, and then she did something Sathura 9 had not expected. She looked at Sathura 9 and asked calmly if the Moon Admiral's rank insignia meant he was the senior officer of the fleet or the senior officer of the entire Moon military branch. Sathura 9 blinked. Fleet commander, she said. Not branch. Voss nodded as if this confirmed something. Then she stepped to the communications panel herself, stood straight and opened the return channel. Her voice was unhurried, pleasant even. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent a long time practicing the art of speaking without giving away more than they chose to give. Admiral Doris 7, she said. My name is Commander Elara Voss of the USCS Enduring Resolve. We are happy to speak with you. Before we discuss your request, I want to make sure we are starting from an accurate, shared understanding. Marin, please transmit the file. Sathura 9 looked at Marin's console in confusion. She had not known about any file. Across the channel there was a brief silence as the Moon fleet systems received whatever Marin had sent, then a longer silence, then the sound of several people on the other end speaking in low, urgent tones that were just barely caught by the open channel before. Someone muted it from that side. Commander Voss waited. The channel reopened after 4 minutes. What is this? Admiral Dorsch Evans' voice was still flat, but something had shifted in it. That is a technical summary, Commander Voss said pleasantly, of the sensor data we have collected on your fleet since you entered our detection range. Hull configurations, propulsion outputs, weapon specifications, shield frequencies, and formation. Tactical analysis took Marin about 40 minutes to compile. We wanted you to know that we have read your weapon specifications thoroughly, Admiral, and we would like you to reconsider your current approach. She said it the way you might tell someone they had forgotten their coat, gently, without drama, as a simple and helpful observation. The silence from the Moon fleet lasted a very long time. Then slowly the 40 warships began to move, not toward the enduring Resolve, sideways, opening the course line, clearing the path. Admiral Dorsch Evans' next transmission was noticeably shorter and noticeably quieter than his first. He requested a formal communication session at the earliest convenience. He did not mention the boarding order again. Sethra 9 stood very still and watched the Moon fleet part around the enduring Resolve like water around a stone, and she felt something move through her chest that was equal parts amazement and a very specific kind of relief. The Asari vessel arrived 6 hours later. It did not form a blocking pattern. It came in slowly with its running lights set to the ceremonial white configuration that the Asari used for occasions of deep significance, and it hailed the enduring Resolve in a voice that was noticeably unsteady. Lead priest identified herself as first voice Soren Eli. She said that the theocracy had sent her with a message. She read it in full on the open channel, and her voice shook only slightly during the reading. The message said that the Asari kept old texts and that those texts had spoken of a people who would be lost and would come back changed. It said that the theocracy had not been certain for a very long time whether those texts described something real or something imagined. It said that the arrival of the enduring Resolve had answered that question, and that the theocracy considered itself to owe the people of this ship a significant debt for what had been said to their ancestors in a time long past. It ended by asking simply, and with no political weight attached, if the crew of the enduring Resolve would accept a greeting. Commander Voss listened to the message in full. Then she looked at the ceiling in the way she sometimes did when she was thinking carefully. Marin, she said, is the old word for greeting still in the formal language records? Yes, Commander, Marin said. The original Earth formal greeting used in the pre-departure diplomatic records. Send it, Voss said. The old word in the original language. Sethara 9 heard the transmission go out. A single spoken word, short and rounded at its edges, in a language that had not been heard outside the ship in 30,000 years. On the Asari vessel, someone who had spent 2 days composing a message and had been shaking the whole way out here began to cry. By the time the Valkyrie response vessel arrived 6 days later and formally placed Sethara 9 under official custody, the enduring Resolve had held 3 separate communication sessions with the Moon fleet, received a ceremonial exchange of gifts with the Asari, delegation, and Marin had politely declined 4 requests for technical information from parties that Sithara 9 could not identify but suspected were Moon Intelligence Services operating under false identifiers. The Valkyrie officer who came aboard to collect Sithara 9 was young and visibly uncomfortable with his surroundings. He delivered the formal custody notice without making eye contact with anything, confirmed that she would be transported home for review, and asked in a very small voice whether she had any personal belongings to collect. She had a bag. She collected it. Commander Voss walked her to the docking connector. Herself, they stood at the hatch for a moment without speaking. Will you be in trouble? Voss asked. Probably. Sithara 9 said. I went absent without leave and made unauthorized contact with an unknown vessel. She paused. I think it was worth it. Voss looked at her for a moment with those still, deep eyes. Then she held out her hand in a gesture that Sithara 9 had seen in the human log entries, the old greeting and farewell, an open right hand extended, offered to be taken. Sithara 9 took it. The grip was firm and warm. Tell them the truth, Voss said. All of it. Don't let them make us into something simple. Sithara 9 nodded. She went through the hatch. Behind her, the enduring result closed its doors and pressed on, steady and unhurried, toward the light of home. Around it, the galaxy watched. For the first time in 30,000 years, it had something new to think about. The hearing room in the Valkyrie consensus headquarters was designed to make people feel small. It was a large circular chamber with high ceilings and tiered seating that curved upward on all sides, so that whoever stood in the center was always looking up at the people judging them. The walls were pale gray stone, smooth and cold. The lighting was sharp and white. There were no windows. It was a room built entirely for the purpose of making things official and uncomfortable, and it was very good at its job. Sithara 9 stood in the center of it and did not feel small. She had spent 11 days aboard the enduring Resolve. After that, it was difficult to feel small anywhere. The review panel was made up of 7 senior officials, all of them considerably older than her, all of them looking at her with the specific expression that authority figures use when they are trying to decide whether someone has been foolish or dangerous, or both. Senior Director Vosmarin sat at the center of the panel, his forearms folded in a way that communicated disapproval across every cultural boundary Sithara 9 knew of. He asked her to explain herself. She did. She told them everything. She started from the contact report she had found in the low-priority queue, and she went all the way through to the moment she had stepped back through the docking connector with her bag in her hand. She did not rush it, and she did not soften it. She told them about Marin and the logs. She told them about the drive failure and the void in 30,000 years of rebuilding. She told them about the biological changes and the science and the return path. She told them about Commander Voss and the immune fleet and the single word sent back to the Asari priest. She talked for 4 hours. By the end of it, the 7 officials were sitting very still, and the disapproving expression on Vosmarin's face had changed into something that had no clean name, something between professional concern and a feeling that the ground had moved slightly under his feet without warning. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then Vosmarin asked the question she had expected him to ask, "What do they want?" C-9 had thought about how to answer this. She had thought about it for the entire 6-day journey back from the outer veil. I asked Commander Voss. That, she said, she told me they want to go home. The senior director looked at her. That is not an answer. I know, Cytherea. 9 said, that is what I thought too. At first, I spent 11 days trying to understand it, and I think it actually is the answer, but it took a long time before I believed that something could be that simple. Vosmarin unfolded his arms and folded them again in a different arrangement, which among Valkyrie meant deep uncertainty. He looked at his colleagues. They looked back at him. No one seemed to have anything helpful to add. Administrative charges against Cytherea 9 were formally reduced to a written warning, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of admitting that punishing her further would have felt absurd under the circumstances. She was reassigned from the Central Archive to a newly created office with the temporary title of Human Contact Liaison, which meant that she was now officially the most knowledgeable person in the consensus on a subject that every other department was suddenly and urgently interested in. She went to work. The enduring resolve continued moving. It did not stop, and it did not slow down, but it communicated openly and regularly with all 3 galactic powers, and Marin managed those communications with a patience and a skill that Cytherea 9, watching from her new desk in the consensus, found herself admiring deeply. The galactic powers wanted information. They wanted to understand what was coming. They sent scientists and diplomats and intelligence analysts, and, in one memorable case, a Mune economist who seemed primarily concerned with calculating the potential trade value of whatever technology the humans had developed, which Marin politely declined to discuss. What they got instead of technical briefings or political negotiations were conversations. Commander Voss spoke with anyone who requested a session. She spoke with Valkyrie historians who had spent their careers studying extinct civilizations and who sat through entire conversations in a state of visible shock. She spoke with Mune Council members who had come prepared to negotiate and left looking thoughtful and unsettled. She spoke with the sorry priests who wept quietly at various points and kept asking her questions about the void that she answered with the same patient honesty she brought to everything. None of these conversations produced formal agreements or political documents. They produced something harder to measure but more important: understanding, or the beginning of it. Cytherea 9 read the transcripts of every session. She had requested access as part of her liaison role, and it had been granted, which she suspected meant that her superiors were hoping she would be able to make sense of things that they could not. She was not sure she could make sense of everything, but some things she understood more clearly with every transcript she read. The scientists who spoke with the crew of the Enduring Resolve came away from those conversations in states ranging from quiet amazement to something close to crisis. The first major session involved a team of 12 Valkyrie physicists considered the best in the consensus, who had requested a technical discussion regarding the Enduring Resolve's drive systems. They were senior people, decorated researchers, and they had prepared a list of highly specific questions. Marin answered the questions. The session was Supposed to last 2 hours, it lasted 9. The transcript of that session was classified almost immediately, but Sethra 9 had clearance to read it, and she read it 3 times, the first time because she wanted to understand it, the second time because she had not fully believed it the first time, the third time because she wanted to make sure she was not misreading the part where the lead physicist, a Valkyrie named Vorasin, who had published over 200 scientific papers in his career, stopped the session and said, in a voice the transcript described as quiet, that he needed a moment. He had needed the moment because Marin had just explained briefly and clearly the fundamental principle behind a branch of physics that the Valkyrie had theorized might exist but had not been able to develop because several of the prerequisite mathematical frameworks were not yet complete. Marin had not only explained the principle, Marin had explained the mathematical frameworks that led to it, the experimental methods that had confirmed them, and 3 practical applications that the enduring resolve had been using for approximately 8,000 years. Vorasin had needed his moment because he was doing rapid mental calculations and arriving at an uncomfortable conclusion that a complete review of his own life's work in light of this information would likely require significant revision of his most important findings. He was not the only one. The session transcripts from the biology team were worse or better, depending on how you looked at it. The Valkyrie's leading expert in biological modification and adaptive physiology listened to a 2-hour summary of the changes the enduring resolves crew had made to themselves over 30,000 years, and then asked carefully whether she could have access to the full research record. Marin told her the full research record was approximately 4.7 million documents. The biologist said she would like to start with the summary index. Marin said the summary index was 90,000 documents. There was a pause. Send me the first 1,000, the biologist said, and I will let you know when I have finished them. The conversations Sethra 9 found most interesting, however, were not the scientific ones. They were the ordinary ones. The sessions where members of the crew simply talked about life on the ship, about what they did every day, about how they thought about things. These sessions had not been formally requested. They had grown out of the diplomatic conversations, moments where the exchange of official information had given way to something more personal. Commander Voss had allowed them and then quietly encouraged them, and Sethra 9 suspected that this had been a deliberate choice. Let people talk, let them see us as people. One session that Sethra 9 kept returning to involved a young crew member named Dale, who appeared to be somewhere in his mid-20s, though precise age was difficult to estimate given the biological differences. He had been pulled into a conversation with a junior Valkyrie diplomat named Terran 6, who was close to Sethra 9's own age and had apparently asked, out of genuine personal curiosity rather than official duty, what it felt like to grow up on a ship. Dale thought about it for a while before answering. The transcript noted a pause of almost a full minute. Then he said that he did not have a comparison since he had never grown up anywhere else. But he said that the ship felt very large and very small at the same time. Large because there was always something new to learn, always a project running, always older crew members who had spent decades working on problems that you could join and contribute to even as a young person. Small because you knew everyone and everyone had known your parents and everyone would know your children, and that was sometimes a weight and sometimes a comfort, and usually both at the same time. He said that the thing that surprised visitors most when they heard about life on the ship was that it was not sad. They always expected it to be sad, he said, this small closed world moving through the enormous empty dark, but it was not sad, it was very full. There was too much to do and too much to think about and too many people to care about for sadness to have much room. Terran 6 asked him if he was afraid of what he would find when they reached the galaxy. When he reached Earth, Dale said yes. He said he thought most of the crew was afraid, though they did not talk about it the way the question implied. It was not a sharp fear. It was the gentle fear that comes before something you have wanted for a very long time, when you start to wonder whether the real thing can possibly be as good as the version of it you have carried in your mind. He said that he had grown up learning the word for homesickness, the untranslatable word, and that it was interesting to be feeling it for a place he had never been. Terran 6 did not have a response to that. The transcript noted another long pause and then a topic change. Sithra 9 read that exchange and sat with it for a while before she moved on to the next file. The galactic powers convened their first joint emergency session in 800 years. It was held in neutral space aboard a station that had been built centuries ago precisely for this kind of meeting, and had been used so rarely that parts of it had to be reopened and cleaned before the delegations arrived. Representatives from all three powers sat around a table that was notably uncomfortable for everyone, which was probably intentional. The meeting lasted 3 days. Sithra 9 attended as the Valkyrie human contact liaison, which made her one of the more junior people in the room, but also, as it quickly became apparent, one of the only people in the room who had actually been aboard the enduring resolve and spoken at length with its crew. This made her opinion sought after in ways that her rank technically did not justify, and she gave it as clearly and as accurately as she could. The central debate of those 3 days was the question that Vosmarin had not been satisfied with the first time. What do they want? The Moon Collective had prepared a formal threat assessment. It was a thorough document that outlined every possible aggressive scenario involving a technologically superior vessel crewed by a biologically enhanced species moving through galactic space without authorization. It had 47 pages. Sithra 9 read it and thought that every page demonstrated exactly how little its authors understood what they were dealing with. She said so, which caused a period of tension that took most of the second day to settle. What she tried to explain and what she felt with increasing frustration was not landing with the weight it deserved, was that the threat assessment was built on a model of behavior that did not apply to the crew of the Enduring Resolve. It assumed that superior power led naturally to the desire for dominance, that a species capable of demonstrating strength would demonstrate it through force, that what a civilization built across 30,000 years of isolation would be used for conquest. None of those assumptions, she said, matched anything she had heard or seen aboard the ship. The immune delegation asked how she could be certain superior capability could be hidden. peaceful presentation could be. Strategy. Saturnine looked at the immune delegate and said, as patiently as she could, that if the enduring resolve had wanted to use its capability aggressively, it had had 40 immune warships sitting in a blocking formation in front of it 9 days ago and had chosen to send a data file instead of a weapon. The immune delegate had no good answer. For that, on the third day, the Asari representative, a quiet elderly priest named Geron IV, said something that shifted the tone of the room. He said that the other powers were spending a great deal of time trying to decide what the humans were going to do to the galaxy. He suggested they might benefit from spending some time considering what the galaxy had already done to the humans. He said this without accusation, in the mild tone of someone stating an obvious fact, but the room was quiet after it, in a different way than it had been quiet before. Saturnine filed her own report to the consensus panel the evening of the third day. It was not a political document. She had been asked for one, but she wrote what she actually believed. Instead, she wrote that the crew of the Enduring Resolve had spent 30,000 in conditions that would have broken most civilizations in a fraction of that time. She wrote that they had responded to those conditions not with despair or rage or the calcification of old trauma into aggression, but with work, constant, dedicated, creative work. They had built things and rebuilt them and built them again. They had changed themselves carefully and thoughtfully. They had maintained a culture across 47 generations in a closed environment and had managed to keep it kind. She wrote that the galaxy's greatest concern should not be what the humans intended to do. The galaxy's greatest concern should be what it said about all of them, that their first response to the return of a lost people was 40 warships and a threat assessment. She sent the report and went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept outside. The Enduring Resolve continued moving, crossing the distance to the outer star systems day by day, its amber lights warm against the cold dark, its 809 crew members going about the rhythms of a life that had been lived generation after generation in the patient certainty that they would eventually get there. They were getting there, and in offices and chambers and meeting rooms across 3 great civilizations. The galaxy was slowly, reluctantly, and not always gracefully beginning to understand that it had not been ready for this, that it had forgotten something important, and that the something important was almost home. The Galactic Congress had not been called to full attendance in 800 years. The building that housed it sat on a neutral station at the gravitational midpoint between the 3 great powers, a massive structure of old stone and older metal built in an era when the galaxy had still believed that talking was better than fighting, and had constructed a place grand enough to make that belief feel permanent. The main chamber was enormous, circular, tiered with seating that rose in great curved rows from a central floor. Every seat had a translation panel. Every seat had a direct communication link. The acoustics had been engineered so that a voice speaking from the center of the floor could be heard clearly in the furthest row without amplification. It had been designed for moments exactly like this one. Sephira 9 sat in the Valkyrie delegation box and looked out at the filling chamber and felt the particular kind of quiet that comes when something large and irreversible is About to happen, every major civilization with galactic standing had sent representatives, some had sent their highest leaders. The immune collective's prime administrator was present in person, which had not happened at any diplomatic event. Living memory. The Asari High Council had come in full ceremonial dress, their golden skin catching the chamber light in that strange way that always made them look like they were lit from inside. There were species present that Sephiroth 9 had only ever read about. Smaller powers, independent systems, old civilizations that kept mostly to themselves but had heard the news and come anyway because some things were too significant to watch from a distance. The chamber was more full than it had been in centuries, and it was still filling. At the center of the floor there was a single chair, simple, plain, made of dark wood. It had been placed there at Commander Voss's request when the Congress had asked what arrangement she preferred for her address. Every other dignitary who had ever spoken in this chamber had done so from behind a formal podium with a delegation standing at their back. Voss had asked for a chair and nothing else. The Congress organizers had found this unusual. They had provided the chair. The enduring resolve was in orbit above the station. It had arrived 2 days earlier, moving into position with the same unhurried steadiness it brought to everything, and the sight of it on the external cameras had produced a reaction across the station that no diplomatic briefing could have prepared anyone for. People had stopped in corridors to look at the screens. Work had paused. Conversations had dropped to nothing. Even people who had been following the story closely and thought they understood what was coming had found themselves standing still with the breath caught in their chest when the ship actually appeared. It was one thing to read about a 4 km vessel that had been rebuilt across 30,000 years in the intergalactic void. It was another thing to see it sitting in space above you, its ancient and patched hull carrying 30 millennia of survival in every seam, its amber lights burning warm and steady against the dark. Marin had been in continuous communication with Congress logistics throughout the approach, coordinating docking arrangements, translation protocols, security considerations. The communications had been described by the Congress logistics team as the most efficient and pleasant they had ever managed, which said something because Congress logistics had a reputation for being difficult. A shuttle had brought Commander Voss and a small party of 4 crew members to the station the previous evening. Sephiroth 9 had been at the docking bay when they arrived in her official capacity as liaison, but also simply because she had wanted to be there. She had not seen Voss since the day she left the ship. Voss had stepped off the shuttle in the same simple clothes with the same unhurried bearing and had looked around the docking bay with the careful attention of someone seeing something new and wanting to see it properly. Her 4 crew members had done the same, all of them looking at the station, at the people moving through it, at the sheer ordinary variety of galactic life, with expressions that were very controlled, but could not entirely hide the depth of what was underneath. None of them had ever seen this before, any of it. Voss had noticed Sephiroth 9 and walked over. Without ceremony, she had asked how the hearing had gone. Sephiroth 9 had said it had gone adequately and that her career had survived. Voss had said good and had meant it, and they had stood together for a moment in the comfortable way of people who had shared something significant. Then Voss had looked around the docking bay again, at the dozens of species moving through it, at the lights and the noise and the living, breathing reality of a galaxy that had been only signals and records for 800 years. "It's louder than I expected," she had said quietly to no one in particular. Saphira 9 had not had an answer for that, but she had understood it. The Congress session opened with formal proceedings that took an hour and a half, in which most people in the chamber endured with polite patience while thinking about what came after. When the formal proceedings were complete, the Congress Speaker, a senior Valkyrie administrator named who had been organizing this event for 3 weeks and had not slept well in any of them, announced that the representative of the USCS Enduring Resolve would now address the full Congress. The chamber went very quiet. Commander Ella Voss walked to the center of the floor alone. She sat down in the plain wooden chair. She looked up at the thousands of faces looking back at her from the tiered rows, every shape and color and configuration that galactic life had produced, all of them still, all of them watching. She did not use notes, she did not speak from a prepared text, she spoke the way she did everything, carefully, honestly, and without hurry. She said her name, she said the name of her ship, she said that she was the 47th commander of a vessel that had left Earth 30,000 years ago, with 847 people aboard and a mission that was supposed to last 50 years. She paused there for a moment and let the number sit in the room. Then she told the story, not the technical version, not the diplomatic version, but the plain human version, the one that started with a drive failure and a crew that woke up to find themselves further from home than any calculation could have prepared them for. She talked about the first generation, the people who had understood they were not going home and had chosen to keep going anyway. She talked about the rebuilding of the ship and the long years of research and the careful changes made to themselves across the generations. She talked about the children born in the void, the ones who had never seen a star up close, who had grown up learning a word for homesickness in a language that was not spoken anywhere else in the universe. She talked about the 60 years of calculation that had produced the return path. She described the moment the math had confirmed, and she described it simply, without drama, and the simplicity of it was what made people in the upper tiers of the chamber press their hands together or look away for a moment to collect themselves. She talked about the journey back, 800 years of listening to the galaxy from a distance, learning its languages and its politics and its history, preparing for a return that was still not certain even when they began the final approach. She talked about what they had found when they arrived: moon warships, the Asari priests, the Valkyrie archive clerk who had come looking for them in a rented scout ship because she had found a report in a low priority and had not been willing to let it go. Saphira 9 looked at her hands in her lap when Vass said this. Around her in the delegation box, her colleagues were very still. Then Vass said the part that the galaxy had been waiting to hear, the answer to the question that had been asked in every meeting room and diplomatic session and private conversation since the enduring resolve had been detected. In the outer veil, she said that the crew of the enduring resolve had not come back to make demands, they had not come back to claim territory or demonstrate power, or seek restitution for anything that had happened to their ancestors. In the long silence, they had not come back to frighten anyone, though. She understood that their arrival had frightened people, and she did not hold that against them. They had come back because it was home, not the galaxy, not any political structure or civilization within it, home in the oldest and most specific meaning of the word, the place your people came from, the ground your first ancestors had walked on, the star that had warmed the world where everything that you were had first begun. They wanted to go to Earth. They wanted to land. They wanted to feel the ground of a world beneath their feet, something none of them had ever done, something 47 generations had told their children they would one day do. They wanted to see the star called Sol rise over a real horizon. They wanted to put their hands in actual soil. That was all. The chamber was very quiet when she finished, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full of thousands of people breathing and thinking and feeling things that were too large for immediate words. Then the Asari high priest, old Jonah Sefu, had spoken quietly at the summit and shifted the whole tone of the room. Stood up from the theocracy delegation box. He did not go to a speaking podium. He simply stood, and in the clear acoustics of the chamber, his voice carried to every row. He said that the Asari theocracy recognized the people of the enduring resolve as a people who had been lost and had found their way back. He said that in the old language of his faith, there was a formal acknowledgement that was spoken when something long absent returned to its rightful place. He said that he would now speak it, and he hoped the humans would receive it in the spirit in which it was intended. He spoke several sentences in the oldest form of the Asari language, and the translation panels in the chamber rendered them as asterisk. You were not forgotten, you were not replaced. The place you came from waited. Welcome back to the living stars. Asterisk Vass listened to the translation. Something moved across her face. Not a breaking, nothing so dramatic as that. More like the very slight shift that happens in a person who has been holding something steady for a very long time and has just for a moment been allowed to set it down. She said thank you in the old earth language, 2 words, soft and plain. The chamber, against all congressional protocol, began to make noise. The formal resolution granting the enduring resolve and its crew unrestricted passage to the solar system and full rights of settlement on Earth passed with near unanimous support. Before the session ended, the Moon Collective voted in favor. Voss Marion of the Valkyrie Consensus voted in favor and looked Sethra 9. Thought like a person who was doing the right thing and knew it, and was quietly relieved to have gotten there. Handful of abstentions were from minor powers who were still processing what they had heard and had decided that abstaining was more honest than voting on something they had not yet fully understood. It was done. It was official. The paperwork, as Marion had once said to Sethra 9, with what she had come to recognize as the AI's version of dry humor, would take longer than the journey. The enduring resolve broke orbit 2 days later. Sethra 9 watched it go from the station's observation deck. She was not alone. A crowd of people from a dozen species had gathered at the windows, drawn by the same instinct that had brought her there. No one talked very much. They just watched. The great ship moved away from the station slowly at first and then with increasing purpose as its engines brought it to full power. In the clean light of open space it looked exactly what it was, ancient and repaired and rebuilt, carrying the marks of 30,000 years on every surface, not elegant in any conventional sense, but possessed of a kind of gravity that had nothing to do with mass. It looked like something that had decided it was going to survive and had then done exactly that for longer and against worse odds than anything had a right to. Sethra 9 watched until it was a point of light among other points of light, and then, until she could not tell it apart from the stars, she was still standing at the window when her communication panel signaled an incoming message. She read it and read it again, and then turned away from the window and walked quickly to her office because the message required her immediate and full attention, and she did not entirely trust herself to respond to it correctly while still looking at the stars. The message was from Marin. It was short. It said that during the weeks of transit between the outer veil and the station, the enduring resolve had been broadcasting on a very specific frequency, not a general communication channel, a targeted signal, narrow band, encoded in a format that only a specific type of receiver would recognize, the format used by the other 11 deep explorer vessels that had launched in the same decade as the enduring resolve. The message said that for the first 3 weeks there had been no response. Then, on the 22nd day, one of Marin's long-range antenna arrays had detected a reply, faint, distant, but unmistakable, the correct encoded format, the correct identification prefix, one of the ships. Then a second reply from a different direction. Then over the following days, more. Marin's message to Sethra 9 included the final count as of the moment the enduring resolve had left station orbit and begun its journey to Sol. 11 signals, all 11 ships, all responding, all inbound. The message ended with a single additional line, written in the same calm and measured tone that Marin used for everything, the tone of an intelligence that had been active for 30,000 years and had learned that the most important things were best said plainly. It said, *, we thought you should know. Before the others do, you will want time to prepare. *, Sethra 9 sat at her desk and looked at the message for a long time. 11 ships, 12 counting the enduring resolve, 12 crews, each one having spent 30,000 years in the void doing what humans did when given an impossible problem and no way out, working, thinking, rebuilding, surviving. 12 ships worth of 30,000-year-old science and biology and culture and quiet, patient, absolute refusal to disappear. The galaxy thought it had been surprised by one ghost ship. It did not yet know that it had barely seen the beginning. She thought about what Voss had told her on the last day aboard the ship. *, tell them the truth, don't let them make us into something simple. *, she pulled up a blank document and began to write, not a threat assessment, not a political briefing, something closer to what Geron 4 had said in the Congress chamber in the old Asari language, rendered into something the galaxy could use, something that started with, they were not silent because they were gone, and continued, they were silent because they were busy, and ended with a sentence that she rewrote 4 times before she found the version that felt true, the version that had no extra words in it, the version That said exactly what the moment required and nothing more. Asterisk end. Now they are coming home, all of them. And the galaxy that forgot them has a choice to make, not about whether to let them in, but about what kind of place it wants to be when they arrive. Asterisk, she saved the document. She sent it to every senior official in the consensus who had clearance to receive it, and several who did not, but who she had decided needed to read it. Anyway, then she leaned back in her chair and thought about a young crew member named Dale who had grown up on a ship in the dark between the galaxies and had learned a word for homesickness before he had learned almost anything else. She thought about 809 people on an ancient, rebuilt, impossible vessel, crossing the last stretch of distance between themselves and a world none of them had ever seen. She thought about a star called Sol and a planet called Earth and soil that had been waiting for 30,000 years for someone to put their hands in it. Outside her window, the galaxy went about its business, trading, arguing, building, moving, the 10,000 ordinary activities of civilizations that had existed long enough to take their own existence for granted. It did not yet know what was coming, but something in the quality of the dark had changed. Something that had been absent for 30,000 years was present again, moving through the stars with amber lights burning warm and steady, carrying in its hull the weight of every generation that had refused to give up. Humanity was not coming back as a footnote. It was not coming back as a ghost. It was not coming back as a warning or a weapon or a lesson in what happens to species that reach too far. It was coming back as itself, as what 30,000 years of darkness and work and love and stubbornness had made it, and the stars, whether they were ready or not, were going to have to make room